Let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Feller-Simmons. So for those of you who don't know, Professor Feller-Simmons joined OU this past fall, and we've just been so lucky. He's in the School of Music, and I think everyone who I've spoken to is all sort of saying, getting these emails, did you hear that we have this new professor? And for the Schusterman Center, additionally, I know that we're so thrilled to have him here on our campus. So Paul Feller-Simmons is a musicologist, and his research studies the sonic and musical cultures of the early modern Western Jewish and Iberian worlds. His current book project is Resounding the Hebrew Nations, Music and Sephardic Community in the Dutch Republic. It examines the musical lives of early modern Sephardic Jews in the Netherlands and investigates how orality functioned as a mode of self-definition across the Dutch colonial sphere. Feller-Simmons is co-editor of The Virgin Mary's Essence in New Spanish Song, and the forthcoming critical edition of Villancicos, which is nice. You like nodded, but at the same time, I was pronouncing it completely wrong. Okay, Villancicos from the Maya Highlands, 17th century vernacular sacred music from the Huehuetenango, that I got right, from the Huehuetenango manuscript collection. His recent scholarship includes sounding the Nasayo.
Pretty close.
Close.
Yeah.
And
I can't.
what is the actual pronunciation?
Roughly Nassau.
Okay. Sounding the Nassau. I shouldn't even try, but I am trying. I should just give it the sounding the Nassau, 18th century Italianate music, oral conversion, and acoustic community formation at the Amsterdam Sephardic Synagogue. And Hoy al Portal Avenido.
That's all. Yeah,
Close enough. Okay. Nativity scenes and the gallant style of the Christmas Villancicos of the Cathedral of Santiago, Chile, which was published in Diagonal Ibero-American Music Review. So as you see him coming in as an assistant professor with an already incredibly impressive publication list and publication and research projects. His research has been supported by numerous fellowships and awards from the institutions, including the German Academic Exchange Service, the Herzog August Bibliothek, the Max Weber Stiftung, the New Netherland Institute, and the Leo Baeck Institute. He's the recipient of the 2022 Noah Greenberg Award from the American Musicological Society, the 2022 Irene Al Memorial Prize from the Society for 17th Century Music, and the 2024 Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Award from the Society for 18th Century Music. And he is originally from Chile, and he earned his BA in music from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, right? And his MA and PhD in musicology from Northwestern University, where he was a presidential fellow. So, and with that, if you could help me to welcome Professor Feller-Simmons today.
Thank you so much. I don't remember sending such a long. Well, thank you so much. That was very generous. So, as you can see, for taking on my dissertation on the Sephardic Atlantic and Sephardic world, I did a bunch of other things. This is one of those side quests. It just so happened that when I was at Northwestern, my advisor, she is a 17th century chiefly gender and music scholar from England. So it was, actually, this was my original project. So without further ado, picture a narrow Venetian street around 1597. Francatripa, a servant, hurries up to a heavy wooden door and begins pounding on it with the confidence of someone certain he will be received. He goes out, waits, knocks again. He is eager to pawn his master's prized object as per his request. Nothing. So he knocks harder. From inside, comes a tangle of male voices. Ai, Baruchai, Badanai, Merdokai. The door never opens. All we are allowed is this overflowing noise. The comedy of the moment rests precisely in what we cannot see. A Venetian observer like Cesare Vecellio, writing in 1590, reminds us why. Jews in Venice, he notes, often dress much like their Christian neighbors. Only the legally mandated yellow hat marks them as Jews, and that is his book. And unfortunately, he only adds an engraving of a woman. So imagine something like that, but with like a pointy hat, yellow hat. If the 1597 scene follows this logic, the men behind the door might look, at first glance, almost like anyone else in the street. But keeping them hidden, known only by their voices, turns that uncertainty inside out. The hat that would have marked them visually is replaced by an acoustic marker, cacophony. The scene comes from Orazio Vecchi, a priest musician active in Modena, whose L'Anfiparnaso is one of the period's most influential musical comedies. Within that comedy lies an Ebraica, a brief episode in which Jews are mocked through music. Scenes like this belong to a wider source base of Jewish musical episodes embedded in Italian comedies at the turn of the 17th century. Across Vecchi's L'Anfiparnaso and his later Le Beglie di Siena, and Adriano Banchieri's Barca di Venezia per Padova, gli Ebrei, the Hebrews, appear as comic figures, each time introduced by some kind of excessive sound. It is from this acoustic archive that my main research question arises. How do these works imagine Jewishness when the medium is sound? And how does that imagined sonic construct interact with contemporary ideas about social order and gender? Put differently, what does it mean for Christian listeners when male Jewish difference is constructed acoustically? Now, to answer that, I approach these pieces as products of Christian imagination. This is not about how Jews really sounded. Instead, these works give us access to what we might call imagined acoustic communities, Christian fantasies of what Jewish sound might be as a collective. Those fantasies, in turn, draw directly from chiefly gendered stereotypes familiar from humoral medicine, prescriptive literature, and carnival satire. Read this way, the comedies become instruments of social pedagogy. Their comedy models improper conduct, and in doing so, they sketch the boundaries of normative Christian masculinity. The feminized Jewish voice becomes a sonic counterexample, a demonstration of how not to sound. So to follow the scenes, we only need a few pieces of context. No, the first, of course, is the repertoire itself. So between roughly 1590 and 1620, Northern Italian writers and musicians produced a compact but influential cluster of comic works. I already mentioned that Vecchi's L'Anfiparnaso appeared in 1597, his Beglie di Siena followed in 1604, and Adriano Banchieri's Barca di Venezia joined the trend in 1605. Bologna's poet Giulio Cesare Croce also belongs here, even though he wrote no music in the modern sense. His comic pamphlets were almost certainly performed aloud and sometimes sung. His writings, moreover, circulated the very Jewish names, cries, and comic situations that later appear in Vecchi Banchieri. This musical comedy itself is rather straightforward. So it is a sequence of polyphonic or multi-voice songs that outline a very loose comic plot. And comic in the Aristotelian sense. That is, typically it mixes some kind of serious plot, mixing pastoral love stories with the comic lighter interludes. So there's a balance there. Now, nothing is staged in the theatrical or dramaturgical sense. Performers sing from part books. Each voice has a different part. So the drama really emerges from the musical texture alone. Now, these works borrow their character world from the Commedia dell'arte, a performance tradition based on masked itinerant actors improvising familiar scenarios and built on stock types. Zani, like Francatripa, the servant, is also added to pedants, braggarts, moneylenders, all of whom are recognized by their accents, verbal habits, and social roles. The Italian musical comedy translates this visual and gestural vocabulary into sound. So instead of improvisation or representation of masks or commedia characters, we get the dialogue, the dialogue, polyphonic exchanges in which each subset of voices represents a specific character or group of characters. Now, because this repertory is so episodic, its comic scenes often function independently of the main plot. You can actually just remove them and the main plot just continues. So a pastoral narrative can pause so that a group of foreigners or lovers or braggarts can appear, sing, and depart without affecting the trajectory of the story. This is crucial for my purpose. It allows the Ebraiche, the explicitly Jewish scenes, to operate as self-contained units of representation. They announce themselves as digressions, each with its own musical logic and its own set of cues. In other words, the sonic evidence we need is already contained fully inside the boundaries of each musical episode. So with this foundation in place, I can now turn to the scene themselves. I'm going to begin with Vecchi's L'Anfiparnaso, and then I'm going to examine Le Veglie di Siena. From there, I will consider Banchieri's parodies of synagogue sound. Finally, I will widen the frame to trace how these comic devices intersect with contemporary in the 17th century, ideas of the body, chiefly about circumcision, humoral theory, and the feminization of Jewish men. Let's start with L'Anfiparnaso. In the original 1597 print, each of the vocal part books incorporates the same small woodcut above the music. This image would have been visible to anyone singing from the part books or leafing through the volumes. The woodcut already suggests how the scene should be imagined. It shows Francatripa in the street, one arm lifted, knocking on a plain door in a featureless facade. The only figure we see then is this Christian servant standing in an open urban space. His raised hand is directing the viewer's eye towards the door. But whatever makes this a Jewish scene lies entirely beyond that threshold. The Jews, then, must be imagined as a group inside an enclosed room, removed from the streets and from the performers' and readers' gaze. Vecchi's Argomento confirms this framing. Now, the Argomento is a prose summary that Vecchi prints before each act. It is a brief guide that tells performers and readers who appears and what happens. For this scene, he names the song's entire cast as Francatripa and Gli Ebrei di dentro, that is the Hebrews inside, meaning inside the house and the building. He explains then that Francatripa is going to the Jews to make a pawn, and that he shakes the door violently, and that one hears from within a babble of voices and dreadful speech. Babele, because so the voci è horribile fabele. The paratextual apparatus, that is the woodcut and the argomento, make 3 points unmistakable. First, that Francatripa is outside at the door. Second, that the Jews are inside as a collective. Third, that what comes from them is this babble of voices and horrible speech. Within the overall fiction of the comedy, Francatripa is a lower status Venetian figure who runs errands and schemes on behalf of another merchant called Pantalone. Here, in Vecchi's scene, he comes seeking to leave an object with the Jews in exchange for cash, which already plays on the very, very old stereotype of Jews as moneylenders. The scene, however, takes place on the Sabbath. You can see the very, very less text there. So the Jews refuse to deal with him. Franca Trippa reports to us that they are making synagogue. Chi fa la sinagoga? Sì, Franca Trippa sta. Chi fa la sinagoga? Vecchi, what this means is that Vecchi is choosing a very specific interface. This Christian servant who belongs on the street, and this group of Jews who are literally inside the house, audibly at prayer. The musical staging turns the Jews then into what we call an acousmatic presence. They are heard but never seen. For listeners and performers, they exist only as a mass of voices on the far side of a barrier. Even in the printed list of personaggi, the characters, that opens each part book, they only appear as Hebrei in casa, the Hebrews in the church. You can see everyone else has a name, except the Jews. They now a similar spatial pattern appears in the Commedia dell'arte scenarios. These are improvisational settings printed to help the itinerant companies. Flaminio Scala's Teatro delle Favole Rappresentative from 1611, which is the best known scenario compilation, includes a plot in which Dottore Graziano, another mask, and his servant Pedrolino go tra gli ebrei, that's among the Hebrews, to see whether Pantalones, son Orazio, has sold two prized tappeti alessandrini, the Alexandrian carpets, the rugs. They suspect that the wayward student in Bologna pawned the carpets or the rugs with Jewish moneylenders. Again, so as in Vecchi's scene, Christian characters often approach Jews who are imagined as occupying a separate enclosed space. The action often occurs outside, at the threshold, with the Jews located just beyond it. Scala's scenarios, however, are overwhelmingly set in streets and piazzas. Domestic interiors are usually reserved for women who appear sometimes at windows or on balconies when they address men below. A bit like Shakespeare's, like I'm thinking of Romeo and Juliet, like this already. Italian moralists echo an image of female domesticity. For example, Leon Battista Alberti in De la Famiglia has a male speaker protest that it would be demeaning, and I quote, to remain shut up in the house among women when he has manly things to do among fellow citizens and distinguished foreigners. Against this backdrop, Vecchi's choice to keep the Jews entirely inside and unseen, di dentro, aligns them with a special position often reserved for women, enclosed, domestic, and approached from outside by men. Contemporary conduct literature intensifies the association. In La Civil Conversazione of 1574, Stefano Guazzo repeatedly links women to domestic space and casts their presence in broader sociability as dangerous. He describes women's conversations as not only useless, but harmful. He stresses how quickly a woman who appears publicly can be judged a prostitute and upholds silence as supremely praised in women. Three women, he approvingly cites, make a marketplace because, I quote, where there is least heart, there is most tongue. Noise, publicity, uncontrolled speech, and the open street become threats to female honor, which must be protected through enclosure and quiet. So set against Guazzo's ideal, Vecchi's scene reads as an inversion. The Jews occupy the feminized interior, but what spills out from their house, the casa, is akin to the noisy marketplace, he fears. The comedy arises in part from that clash. The wrong kind of people making the wrong kind of sound in the space Guazzo would want to keep silent. One might object that in 16th century Italy, women are not always kept off the stage or out of view. Literature, visual culture, and commedia itself often shows women, as I mentioned before, on balconies and during performance in public theaters. And L'Amphiparnaso elsewhere features female voices in such settings. But the point, and again, worth repeating, is not that all women stayed inside and all men stood outside. It is that each scene in this comedy establishes its own special logic. Now, as historian Eleazar Gutberth has shown, even Judeo-Christian disputations were anchored in gender divisions of space, excluding women, even as Inquisition records reveal that women express polemical ideas in domestic settings. What makes his staging sharper is the moment in which Vecchi wrote it. Just 3 years earlier, in 1594, Bologna expelled its Jews. An event Pompeo Visani narrates in his Descrizione della città, that's the Città di Bologna, the city of Bologna. Pope Clement VIII justified the measure by accusing Jews of robberies, contracts, and illicit trade, along with, and I quote, many enormous misdeeds. And Visani notes that they were driven out, never to return. At the same time, the Bolognese Jew Cesare Croce was publishing pamphlets in nearby print shops that turned Jews into noisy urban figures, which directly inspired Vecchi. A short letter from Croce confirms how direct this inspiration could be. In his Terzetti del Croce al Vecchi, from just before Vecchi published the L'Anfiparnaso, there Croce recalls that Vecchi had come expressly to seek him out. And then he promises to supply Vecchi with material in quei linguaggi, in certain languages, adding that he will put everything del naturale. So long as Vecchi sends the subject in prose first. And I want you to remember this idea of del naturale, del natura, because it's going to reappear in Vecchi later on. The exchange documents a collaboration in which Croce provided then textual matter, and Vecchi adapted it later into polyphonic fabric. At least that's implied there. So Vecchi's decision in 1597 to imagine Hebrews inside as this disembodied vocal presence has a double edge. On the printed page and in sound, Jews are contained behind a door, their presence reduced to this chorus of horrible speech. In the surrounding city, they are being removed from civic space altogether. If we now listen to the opening of the Vecchi's Ebraica, the sonic counterpart of that spatial framing becomes unmistakable. When the Jews first answer Francatripa, they do so with overlapping calls. Ai, Baruchai, Badanai, Merdokai. The text combines recognizably Jewish sounding names, Baruch, Mardokai, with some distorted forms like Badanai. The effect depends then on accumulation. I guess what Roland Barthes would call a reality effect. Almost immediately, the text breaks into pseudo-Hebrew strings. These strings of syllables are there to sound foreign and collective. For listeners familiar with street performance, Crocean pamphlets, and marketplace caricatures, the shorthand would have been enough. This was the Jewish noise they expected to hear. So, for example, in his Piazza Universale, Tommaso Garzoni classifies, and it's an scenario compilation for an improvisational practice. Garzoni classifies a Jewish charlatan among the ciurmatori of the piazza, several characteristic, say, colorful characters, noting how he borbotando, alegoi, badanai, badanai. This is nonsense. Which steers this crowd of Jews into formulaic noise. Now I'm going to play a little bit of music. I've been talking for a long time. Francatripa's responses sharpen this acoustic boundary. He beats on the door, rendering the text, as you're going to listen to, as tick, tock, tack. But as I mentioned before, he's not admitted. He attempts an address in subtly faulty Latin. He says, "O Hebreorum gentibus," it's just like the cases are all mixed up. And of course, he mangles it. He's not an educated person, meaning that his own failed performance of Latin exposes the class dynamics that are typical embedded in the comedy. When the Jews, actually, let me play that. The openings. The performers are, of course, exaggerating the difference, which is, for this case, very fortunate. Otherwise, it's up to you to see if, how appropriate is that. Now, even later, when the Jews switched to Italian, around there, here, their speech appears marked by some kind of fictitious accent, say incorrect pronouns and syntax, and by foreign sounding endings such as podem, scanet, and fluet. Musically, the writing intensifies the sense of undifferentiated mass. The Jewish lines are long and meandering. There is no fully traceable melody. Instead, entries crowd on another. A lower voice introduces, for example, a fragment, Kalamala Balachot, you see there, and the entire ensemble echoes it quickly, erasing internal distinction. The texture then thickens into what we might call a polyphonic babble. By the time we reach the phrase, it is Sabbath, and we cannot, it is Sabbath, que no podem, it cycles through the full ensemble 7 times, repeated in staggered, overlapping rhythms. The listener hears an unstable crowd whose sonic identity rests on density, repetition, and nonsense text. There we go. Okay. Becky's prefatory claim in La Fipanazo that La Fipanazo serves as a mirror of human life in this comedy, and that this comedy, and I quote, represents under different persons almost all the actions of the private man, lands differently here. In the Hebraica, the mirror shows us what Christian performers and listeners were primed to hear when they imagined Jews at prayer. A crowd behind a door, this torrent of unintelligible syllables, and of course, refusal. In other words, the Jews occupied this often feminized interior that I mentioned before, and yet their uncontrollable sound burst through its boundaries. The second Jewish scene appears in Le Vegli de Siena, a work whose premise differs sharply from the Third Exchange in La Fiparnaso. Here, the frame is aristocratic leisure. The premise of this collection is that a group of nobles spend several evenings together engaging in refined pastimes, including the Gioco dell'imitazione, this competitive game in which participants impersonate various social types. The Hebraica emerges at the close of one of the evenings, after a guest has imitated a Tedesco, a German, and a Venetian. And then the hostess turns to Julia, the character of Julia, this noblewoman, and assigns her the crowning challenge. She must imitate gli ebrei del natura, again, realistically or by nature, echoing Croce's language. The closing lines of the preceding game announces this with ceremonious weight, as you can see here. And I translate, Julia has the greatest honor of imitating the Jews, but the clock is already making itself heard. Let the game end and everyone go to sleep. Now imitate the Jews del natura. The emphasis on del natura alters the logic of the scene. So instead, at least in theory, instead of the stylized exaggerations typical of this mimetic contest, Julia is urged to perform an imitation grounded on what the group imagines as Jewish nature. Julia responds with a compact lament. Run, run, Mr. Aaron, because the Gentiles, the Goy, have killed our Pepere and our Ocon. Badanai, beware if they have kidnapped him. Merdochai, if they have seized him. Several elements signal continuity then with the Amfipernaso, the same small cluster of names, Aaron, Badanai, Merdechai, and the quasi-Hebraic accent, now paired, of course, with this narrative of violence against Jewish bodies. The tokens already appear in Vecchi's direct literary model, that is Girolamo Vargagli's Dialogue on Aristocratic Games, which advises that when representing a Jew, one must not call him, say, Giovanni or Francesco, but rather Abraham or Melchizedek or Moises. The overlap, however, extends closer to Croce's Risa Tremenda fra Mardocaio Badanai, where all three names reappear and where Croce explains that actually Pepper, the pepere, is a gander. And also in Croce's Lamento e Morte dei Manás Hebreo, which recounts a 1590 execution of a Jew in Ferrara, invoking again Badanai, Merdechai, and Aaron while narrating the torture, dismemberment, and death during the Shabbat. The iterations of this micro-lexicon across literature, street performance, and musical comedy make claim that Julia's natural imitation, the natura, is entirely convention-driven. This scene also reveals something about the structure of Jewish representation in Le Veglie. Whereas the game's early imitations mimic identifiable individuals, again, specific fool, specific lover, specific one Tedesco, one German, the Jews appear only as a collective. In the Dramatis Personae, they are listed once again as the Hebrews, the Hebrei. The opening aligns a scene, curiously enough, the opening aligns a scene close to Roman Carnival, where Jews were forced to run barefoot in the Corsi degli Ebrei, forced to sprint along the Corso amidst jeers of crowds immediately before the horse races. Here, the opening cry, run, 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 corrid, corrid, meseranon, is entrusted to, it's a subgroup of voices, the tenor, quinto, and bass, which is a lower register, which also ends the scene repeating that Badanai, they have stabbed him, they have kidnapped them, they have skinned them. Master Aaron's response, assigned now to the soprano, alto, and bass group, much higher, creates the impression of multiple high-pitched speakers within a single Jewish crowd. Now, the instruction that Julia imitate Jewish men, the natura, or naturally, therefore stages already an act of gender crossing. In the context of aristocratic Italian sociability, this is quite significant. As Baldassare Castiglione insists, the ideal courtier must avoid affettazione, or over-theatricality, if you will, and cultivates sprezzatura, an untranslatable concealment of effort. Le Veglie's comic mimicry thus lies near the boundaries of acceptable elite behavior for men, but is perhaps permissible, even delightful when performed by a noblewoman. And here, we need to remember the potential performers. When these pieces were sung, it was often by the same kind of musically literate, rhetorically educated individuals who populated Vecchi's fictional Veglie. These were the people who had to be capable of catching, for example, Franca Trippa's subtly botched Latin, and equally capable of appreciating how the music itself forces the singers into precisely the kind of affettazione that Castiglione warns against. In this sense, Julia becomes the ideal vessel for natural Jewish imitation, precisely because the Jews appear as unmanly. The applause, there's actually a piece called Applauso that celebrates Julia, confirms Julia's success. As it reads, as in heaven starry Julia shines among the stars, so among these beauties you gain the highest honor in singing and imitating with manners so pleasing to us. In other words, Julia wins the evening's game. Now, what to think of this spatial setting? Although Julius Jews appear in the open street rather than in a door, they remain contained by a different mechanism. They are bound by fear and victimhood. Vecchi's Jews are passive sufferers whose emotional and vocal excess once again codes them as not masculine enough. 13. Adriano Banchieri, a religious man and musician just like Vecchi, set his Ebraica within, again, a very different frame. La Barca di Venezia is a comic tableau in which an assortment of social types share a boat on the river Brenta. The premise is rather panoramic, so we have gondoliers, merchants, courtesans, and foreigners all confined in the same vessel, speaking and singing over one another. It is in this floating cross-section of society that we have the two Jewish figures. Now, Banchieri approaches the Jewish type with full knowledge of Vecchi's approach. In 1600, before composing the Barca, Banchieri issued a 3-voice reduction of l'Anfiparnaso called Il Studio Dilettevole. Now, weirdly enough, the Jewish scene is the only one he omitted. But the gesture is telling. Vecchi had pioneered this musical comedy, and Banchieri learned directly from him, meaning that it is to be assumed that his Jewish scene builds on Vecchi's model. Lo and behold, of course, it does. Even the layout is basically the same. Banchieri's Ebrei first appear in the Argomento once again, where he frames the entire parody through a description that foregrounds noise. So while ferrying to Dolo, they again make synagogue at the behest of a man from Brescia, Betel and Samuel, with great racket. Now the term is gran fracasso, great racket signals at once the sonic character of the scene and the allegorical weight of synagoga, a word that in medieval Christian rhetoric indexed religious stubbornness and supersessionism. What follows then is the Ebraica proper. We have this onomatopoeic 5-voice strumming figures, la trai na na na, la trai na na na, that frame the Jewish duet. A Brescian merchant introduces it with the line, come here, come here and listen to Samuel, who wants to hold or make synagogue with Betel. And thus, we're experiencing Jewish sound through a Christian listener who calls attention to it once again. Once the Jews begin this dialogue, the dialogue collapses into a collective sonic mass just named synagoga. We don't have the names anymore, just synagoga. And Betel and Samuel sing, Asach, Mustach, Od, Sorokot, Barukai, Oga, Magoga. Nonsense, accumulations of pseudo-Hebrew phrases, Baruchai, Barukaba. I'm going to go back to Barukaba, it actually means something. Interspersed with obsessive syllables. Most strikingly, the repeated ho, 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 ho at the very end. You can see it there. Sure, let me play this. Drumming. Very Such lexical repetition already appears in Croce. So am I arguing that Croce is really the model when in his, for example, in La Risa Tremenda, Mordecai's soliloquy disintegrates in this pes, sonnet, 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 ballet, 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 etc., etc. So it's part of this structural resemblance, this rapid consonants, this nonsense and rhyme, the compulsive repetition suggests that Banchieri as well as Vecchi are drawing at the very least from street level poetics of this noisy Jewish stereotype speech. More distinctive, however, is the musical construction of noise. In the synagogue, as you heard, the top voice drifts behind the bass, producing melodic misalignment. You have it there. Again, if you can read music, the better. So if not, you heard a little bit of it. As you're producing this melodic disalignment, the voices avoid cadential closure. So instead of arriving, the melodic line loops back on, they loop back on themselves. And towards the end, really, the music intensifies this motionlessness through the fixation, ho, 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 ho. The music then creates a sonic image of aimlessness. What is this? Of course, he is parodying synagogue chant. Now, for 17th century readers, the conceptual association between noise and synagogue was well worn. For example, Orazio Scaletta in his Scala di Musica used precisely the synagogue as an example of chaotic collective chanting. He says, if everyone wants at the same time to execute a trill, it will seem to you as though you were in the synagogue of the Hebrews. The synagogue then was this metaphor for uncoordinated ornamentation and the lack of sound hierarchy. Travelers soon repeat the same acoustic scripts. For example, in 1608, English traveler Thomas Coryat he reported that he visited the Venetian ghetto and heard synagogue service. And he describes the cantors, the Hassan's delivery as, and I quote, an exceedingly loud yelling, undecent roaring, and as it were a beastly bellowing, claiming that the voice was strained so high as if he sung for a wage, and that it drowned out the rest of the voices. In 1645, another English traveler, John Evelyn, attending a circumcision in Rome's ghetto, wrote of a multitude. It says, I use, what's the word? A world of people in a chamber who fell singing a Hebrew hymn in a barbarous tone, waving themselves to and fro. The traveler's rhetoric was unmistakably aligned with the Comedies' musical caricatures in their barbarous style of utterance. What's more, early modern writers frequently associate elaborate, ornamental, and non-teleological musical style with effeminacy. Just to give one example among many, Thomas Wright in The Passions of the Mind of 1604, actually 1601, then reprinted 1604, speaks of excessive artifice in music as a sign of, and I quote, manifest loose effeminateness. Bancheri and Beckman are weaponizing these attributes with constructing the synagogue, wandering lines, rhythmic stability, and ornamental clutter. The three scenes we have followed, and Becky's threshold comedy, Julia's imitation, and Bancheri's synagogue, now stand in a very clear relation to one another. Each relies on the same limited repertoire of cues, enclosure or some kind of constraint, eruptions of noise and repetition, unstable vocal registers, and the substitution of collective utterance for individual agency. The question then is why the sonic markers carried such force for some early modern listeners. What allowed this cluster of noises to signify the comic Jewish male type? When placed then alongside contemporary descriptions of circumcision, humoral theories of cold and moist temperaments, and claims about Jewish male, say, leakiness, the sonic caricatures become grounded in physiological claims. Now, in the comedies, and I told you that there was this one word that actually made sense, Jewish characters often and repeatedly greet one another with variants of Baruch haba, a word that preserves a fragment of the Hebrew language. Of course, the underlying form is Baruch haba. They often use as a saying hello, welcome, but from the formula, blessed be he who comes, which derives from the laudatory psalms. Now, in the comedies, however, this phrase circulates as a marker of Jewishness because Christian literate audiences would associate it with intense ritual vocality and, moreover, circumcision. Now, I'm going to give you only one example. There are several that repeat the same. For example, in Historia degli Riti Ebraici, partly written to counter Christian anxieties, Venetian rabbi Leo Modena offers a detailed description of the circumcision ceremony. And he dwells on its oral climax, Once the mohel has completed the ritual, the compare, this is the man who holds the infant during the operation, carries the child to the doorway, where the assembled company, and I quote, yell Baruch haba, which means be welcome. Now, this is repeated by many, many Christian scholars, like especially Johannes Buxtorf in his Synagoga Judaica. Across these accounts, Baruch haba is repeatedly attached to the Brit Milah, to the priest. It is a ritualized cry that accompanies the child's emergence into the hearing of the community. In other words, the Comedies turn this non-liturgical formula into an index of the Jewish marked body at its most vulnerable. Early modern Christian writings return to Jewish circumcision as a wound to masculinity. In polemical treatises, devotional commentaries, and even legalistic writing, the cut is described as often as a diminishment of the male organ. And this is where Daniel Boyarin's intervention can be, again, cautiously useful. In his very famous and polemical Unheroic Conduct, he argues that non-Jewish observers often perceive circumcision as feminizing, sometimes equating it with castration, and using that analogy to rationalize even Roman legal restrictions. For our purposes, and I'm not going to get into Boyarin's wider argument, for our purposes, what matters is the idea that Christian readings construe the circumcised body as altered, marked, and less fully masculine. Second strain that we need to take into account in Christian thought reinforces at least the bodily unease by shifting the meaning of circumcision from flesh to spirit. Now, Paul, in Romans 2:29, he talks about the circumcision is that of the heart, which is a reworking of Deuteronomy's promise that the Lord will circumcise your heart, internalizing and spiritualizing what had been a concrete ritual. In Christian theology, Paul's move frees the new community from a bodily sign that would pose practical obstacles to adult male conversion. From this perspective, Christians possess the, say, supposedly elevated circumcision of the heart, while Jews, paraphrasing St. Augustine, remain bound to the mark of carnal Israel. Now, once circumcision is simultaneously framed as quasi-castration or as an index of the attachment to the flesh, the Jewish male body can be imagined as unstable and incomplete. Early modern fantasies of these porous Jewish bodies built on this early logic. When we listen back to the Comedies through that lens, the sonic traits assigned to Jewish characters, noisy eruption, repetitive syllables that spill beyond semantic control, and refusal to melodic stability begin to reflect these broader anxieties. Medical and moralistic literature of the late Middle Ages. Let's just make sure that I'm on time. Have a little. Medical moralistic literature of the late Middle Ages and early modern periods offer a consistent picture of leaky male Jewish physiology. Several writers begin by linking Jewish occupations to deficiencies of bodily heat. Thomas Aquinas, for example, suggests that usury and other sedentary forms of labor generate little of the natural heat that physical work was thought to produce. The implication is that Jews lack the embodied vigor that marks proper masculinity. Theologian Jacques de Vitry classifies Jews as, and I quote, unwarlike even as women, and in some retellings, this is crucial, subject to menstrual bleeding. In the 14th century, scholar Checo de Ascoli explained Jewish male menstruation, also is sometimes known as the male menses, as divine punishment. So since Christ's death, Jewish men, like women, bleed. By the 17th century, several anatomists repeat the same claims in more clinical details. For example, Thomas Bartholin reports that Jews by nature shed drops of blood from the penis in accordance with the moon, just as it happens to women. Across its disparate texts, Jewish men are imagined as physiologically prone to leakage, their bodies marked by the fluid excesses that humoral theory assigned to women. That was Checo de Ascoli, sorry about that. And that was Thomas Bartholin. Here. So this description rests on Galenic and Abyssinian system in which bodily qualities determine both sex and temperament. In that framework, the ideal male body is hot and dry, fully formed, firm flesh, deep voiced, and emotionally stable. The female body, in contrast, is cold and moist, predisposed to fluxes, high pitch, predisposed to also high pitched voice, and emotional volatility. This is often based on Aristotle's De Generatione Animalium that says that the female is an incomplete male produced when generative heat is insufficient. But even in the 17th century, for example, anatomist Caspar Hofmann writes that elaborate heat is the principle of perfect male formation. He says that, for example, warm semen creates a child who develops quickly, exhibits darker and firmer flesh, develops more body hair, and produces a deeper voice. Placed beside the sources, the comedy's vocal writing maps cleanly into humoral hierarchies. In L'Amphiparnasso, for instance, when the Jewish ensemble enters fully around this area, around measure 17 to 30, the collective tessitura sits noticeably higher than Francatripa's. The canto voice, which would give Francatripa brightness, is excluded from his lines. Only the bass overlaps with the Jewish range. And the same as you probably heard happen. Julia. That's Francatripa. This stands in contrast to what scholars such as Elizabeth and Roger Askham described as an ideal, manly, rough, and stout voice. As such, they can carry writing Jewish vocality as an index of bodies marked by coldness, moisture, and incomplete formation. When the musical comedies place Jews behind doors, or being persecuted, in high tessituras, or in noisy collective textures, they participate in a discursive field that constructs Jewishness as a category. Xander Gilman's insight about stereotyping as a strategy of control suggests that the sonic Jew becomes the vehicle through which the hegemonic group defines the boundaries of acceptable maleness. Thus, to listen attentively to the noisy, high-pitched crowds is to hear about a society anxiously securing its own boundaries through music and sound. And thus, Francatripa's protest that, and he said this, that he's used to being received like a gentleman, lends as a claim to masculinity that the Jews, by design, are never allowed to share. The Jewish characters do not receive Francatripa as a gentleman because they themselves are not framed as gentlemen. Thank you.
Yeah, that we're close to the hour, but maybe what I'll say is people who have to leave obviously have to go, but those of you who would like to stay for another 5-10 minutes for questions, I know that please feel free to do so. Maybe I'll just start by saying like how fantastic and fascinating a talk this was. I don't want to dominate, so maybe I'll let see if there are any questions from the audience first.
Thank you, Paul. I just wanted to ask about the recordings and that the performance practice of singing it in this nasal. I was just wondering, what is the basis for that? No basis. Okay.
That's why the ethics of modern performance. I'm not getting into that at this point. Those nasal tones are nowhere to be found in the instructions, performance instructions. So they are 100% a decision made by the chiefly Christian ensembles. Now they are really good for my argument. Beyond that, I leave it to you to decide whether it's ethical or not.
Thank you for a fantastic, very, very interesting talk. So thank you. I was wondering if today, or I mean, these are contemporary recordings, right? So if when it is recorded today, is there any PC regarding that? How is it received? So
Okay, that is a really good question. Honestly, my Israeli friends think that it's the funniest thing ever. I've been urged to present this in Israel because some of them think that it's just very, very funny. I think that we can laugh about it. Beyond that, I've also seen people reacting, especially in the US, reacting negatively to the modern recordings because of this kind of performance decisions that play into stereotypes that, I mean, there are enough stereotypes in the music already. I don't know if we need to add more on top of that. They are definitely there. I guess that there's this famous, at least in musicology, this famous article called by Don Haran called "The Jewish Nose in Music." So it plays into that stereotype, Jewish nose, and the nice nasalized tone. It's a 19th and 20th century construction.
and how is it received in Europe? Sorry, I just
Actually, no, that's it. And in fact, all the ensembles, these are all European.
so they're nothing. They're all okay with it. I mean, and when it comes out, there's no critique of it.
Never seen a critique of that because I'm not completely sure that they are completely. Again, I don't want to. I will have to ask them. But why did they do it? I haven't done that.
Are these performed nowadays, actually, on the stage?
Yeah, actually, one of the when I first worked on this, only one of the recordings was out. Ever since another one came, that was same thing, like the Banchieri one. No, Le Veglie de Siena was not recorded like that. Actually, the original recording was much more plain. But there's a new recording, brand new, that's on that same.
I was fascinated by your talk, but I was looking for the comedy. And so serious description of distortion, etc. So where is the comedy?
Are you asking me why I'm not funnier? I'm just a boring person. No, for this very specific talk, I think that my point was about the how kind of the reception history and the usage of this music. The comedy, we will have to ask them. I think that they, actually no, I do have an answer for this. Explaining a joke has never been funny. That's my entire paper is explaining the joke. That's where the comedy goes.
Fair enough.
And I tie into that, and I think that first of all, it was just such a fascinating talk and just so incredibly rich and valuable, and just these ideas, like I think about it, obviously like the Merchant of Venice comes to mind, or the Jew of Malta, and these very known anti-Semitic depictions and demeaning depictions of Jews in European culture, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of how it's imagined in sound and depicted in sound is so valuable. I think this maybe ties into the question about the humor. Maybe it's more of a response to that it seems to me the humor is in the situation of power.
Mm-hmm.
For the people who are in a position of power laughing down, like it's like punching down, right?
It's definitely
But
punching
it's
down.
Clearly, like as we understand it, the fact that how this humor it's dehumanizing, and this caricature and these layers of insult, right, that are coming through. And as you show that this is, they're laughing about it because this is a comical figure that they've turned into, while you very rightly show that this also has real life implications, because this is something that's happening. They're disappearing, as you so beautifully put it, from the civic space while being dehumanized in this way that it's just making fun. And I think that that's why it's sort of that it could imagining it being funny at that time, because in that setting, right, and through those eyes. Sorry, that turned into more of an answer and then a question, but it's sort of a discussion of just how interesting and valuable is
That's
it.
great, and I think that's why I insist so much in saying that all points to Cesare Croce as being kind of the ideologies behind this, where we actually have this piece. We were very lucky to have this letter that shows the interaction between Croce and Becky, because he's writing this at the same time, immediately after the Jews were expelled from his city.
Right.
Which is not the same. I think this is the main thing. Croce and literature, there's a lot of studies when it comes to Croce, and it all insists on Croce as being this, of course, all Italian studies. Croce as being this master of displaying the real life of the city, which I think it works until we see that one of those characters is not there anymore. And it's as you're saying, and this is happening immediately after these comedies. We see a wave after wave of expulsions and plagues that, for example, even in Venice when they're not expelled, plagues that directly affect the population, the Jewish population. So again, comedy is a little bit more different where you're punching down, right? You're totally right. Thank you for that.
But at the same time, that if I understand this correctly, it's the whole thing is a kind of commedia dell'arte, sort of entertainment, and so that's where the comedy is.
Yes.
And a lot of it is not in the words per se, but in their antics and.
Right, but remember that Vicky specifically says that this in the prologue as well. This is actually the first song. It says there's no acting here. This is a word that is presented exclusively through the ears. So now, audience, shut up and listen and imagine. So again, there's all the antics have to be represented through sound some way. And I guess that's kind of like that. Yeah, but you need to be literate in the commedia to understand that. This is why it's pretty obvious that the intended audience it's not just anyone, of course, and you need to be able to perform the music, right?
So are the Jews collectively a character in?
Always, they're always a collective character.
Yeah.
Even when in La Barca, when they are named at some point, Samuel and Bethel, when we actually have them, it only says synagoga. We lose the names immediately.
How long do you think that lasted as a identifiable kind of stock character?
That's a really good question. This very specific form of representation of Jews, I have only been able to trace it to, say, the 1620s. And there is something that changes around that time, 1615, 20s, and that is especially in Modena, where the Jewish population is actually actively acting the commedia as well. So we see a rise in publicity in Italy when it comes to Jewish, and then you really see Jewish characters vanishing. And throughout the 17th century, you do see the Jewish communities through different means counteracting this kind of stereotypes. For example, paying this one, I think it's Parma, they're paying the city crier every week to say that it is forbidden to put on this very widespread anti-Jewish comedies. So it starts changing. That's why this is a very short-lived thing.
Well, thank you so much for such a brilliant for presenting us this fascinating topic. Could you say a few more words about the audience? Was the audience actually, you just replied about it, but just elaborate just a bit more. Was the audience actually in this case the elite, or was it actually open to the wider audience in this case? And what was also expected from the audience in terms of reaction?
That is
in the term of the comedy itself or the music itself. Were they allowed to speak out, to boo, to yell aloud, to scream, or to laugh aloud?
Okay, so
in Shakespeare theaters, or maybe not?
No. So this is a really good question. First of all, we need to consider that we know quite a bit about the kind of music circulation and economics when it comes to other musicians, especially musicians who are hired by courts. But Vecchi and Banchetti are not on that level. They are not beholden to the same kind of patrons because they are priests. Vecchi is a priest, Banchetti is a monk. Okay, so that's the first thing. In theory, they are publishing this music So it's in theory available to everyone. But in reality, there are several obstacles that limit the prospective audience quite a bit. First of all, you need to be musically literate. The way that Vecchi and Bianchetti are using commedia tropes, as well as, for example, think of the Francatripa as very subtle, wrong Latin. You really need to know Latin to know that that's wrong. Means that this is meant for highly educated people. Maybe other monks, maybe other priests. For sure, people who are able to buy the part books, meaning that you need to have cash, I'm saying the disposable income. So at the very least, we have a bourgeois and elite audience. And this is around the time when writers like Thomas Morley would say that anyone who is intending to go to university, they need to have a basic understanding of music literacy. So among the bourgeoisie, the upper bourgeoisie, and the nobility, this would be expected. That tells us that that's the intended audience. Of course, overwhelmingly Christian in Italy, Catholic. Now, as for the performance, say stage, this is definitely not meant to be staged on a theater. This is for parties. This would be a party music. So now Vecchi does say, literally says, "Shut up and listen." Now, it's up to different audiences to react in different ways. We know, for example, that in Ferrara, there was highly professional performers, and we know that in those cases there was silence. There was this hierarchy of the musician performing and people contemplating. That was not widespread. My understanding is that elsewhere in the city, this would be, more like raucous practice and people probably laughing and, like drinking and, yeah, doing their best to make this sound cohesively. But final thing, the music sometimes is quite demanding when it comes to the polyphonic ensemble. So, especially when it comes to the JuSt. But I guess that you can botch it and make it even more comical. So again, it's an open-ended question. I have no smoking gun saying we performed the Amphiparnaso in this court and this is what happened. We can only reconstruct it from what we know from the wider practices.
I think maybe that could be a good place for us to end. Thank you so much, and thank you.
Alan Levinson is joining us on Zoom. He wanted to thank you for a wonderful talk, and that he did not realize that the feminization trope went back as far as it did.
Because
yes,
yeah, the modern. This is, of course, this is a modern thing. Some of Gilman, Xander Gilman talks about it, but he thinks it's like a post-Freudian, and of course, Daniel Boyer. You can trace it back, yeah.
So if you join me in thanking, this is just so wonderful. Great.